What's up guys? Today I'm going to be profiling the red Jiren deck that I took to the first ever TCG Metalz tournament and that I ended up piloting to second place. What's up guys? It's the new sensation, Bigger Notation here, and as you would have heard from the intro, I recently entered the first ever TCG Metalz tournament and I ended up playing red Jiren, and then I ended up managing to pilot it to a second place finish, which was pretty incredible. I think that I could have ended up taking the deck to first place, but I definitely misplayed a few times during my final match, but I'm still very happy with second place, especially for the first time entering and for the first time the TCG Metalz is hosting a tournament. So I'll get straight into the deck profile. I feel like the red Jiren list has become fairly standardized just because the engine that you have to play with in the deck is so large. You have to play so many of each of the Jiren cards, and then for the more text spaces, the stuff that you can run, there's definitely some cards that stand out above the rest. So I feel like the red Jiren list has started to become fairly standardized, but it's definitely a really underrated deck, and especially for last format. I think people really slept on it when Cell Surge was considered to be the top deck. Before set 15 was released, Jiren was a really strong counter to Cell Surge, but it also has a really good matchup into a lot of other decks, and it's also one of those decks that's just incredibly good at pushing out rogue decks. So to get straight into it, the leader on both sides has the Spirit Boost 1 auto, where you can basically evolve when your opponent declares an attack, as long as you pay the cost of the evolve skill that of the card that you're playing. And then the activate main on the front side is you take 1 life. Now the taking 1 life is mandatory, so you have to take a life if you want to get the entire effect. But then you look at the top 7 cards of your deck and play up to 1 red Universe 11 from those top 7 in rest mode. His awaken is at 4 or less life. You can untap 1 and draw 1. So even if your opponent doesn't attack your leader at all throughout the game, you're guaranteed to get awakened by turn 4 off of his activate main, which is really helpful. But he doesn't have any inherent draw power on the front side, so he's very reliant on hitting a 1-drop off that activate main, so it's very important that you play a large number of 1-drops. In the list that I'm playing, I've got 12 1-drops that are targets for this activate main in here. I know some lists have been running more. I think that 12 is the optimal number. You could maybe push to 13 if you take out one of the cards that I've got as a tech spot, but I think 12 or 13 is around optimal for this deck. And as you can obviously see, I've got the meta leader for the red Jiren deck, and so that was another reason why I wanted to play it, because it's a meta leader and it's in a meta leader event. I won this off of playing in some of the Fight Night events, so definitely shout out to the Fight Night crew, and shout out to TCG Metalz for sponsoring them as well and for hosting the event. The tournament was run fairly smoothly and I really enjoyed playing in it. Then once the leader is awakened, he gains the auto where on attack he draws a card, which is great. You don't have to hit anything, any top 7 searches to guarantee that you're able to get any advantage anymore. You're just able to swing with leader, and as standard with leaders these days, you just draw a card. He has an auto limit 2 skill where if it's during your turn and you evolve, he gains 5k. So you can push your leader up to 25k base just off that auto alone, which is really incredible. And it's why cards like Double Strike Champa or Double Strike Kai are so strong in the deck, because you can buff your leader up to sometimes like 35k, 45k base Double Strike with just 1 card, which is insanely good. And especially on the leader card, because leader cards are much harder to interact with than battle cards or even unison cards as well. It's a really strong skill to have on the leader card. And then he also has the same auto as on the front side, where you can Spirit Boost to play your evolve stuff during your opponent's turn. So it provides you with a little bit of defense as well as being quite an aggressive deck. And something that's really important to note about this deck is it is pivoted towards a more aggressive style, but you can definitely play it as a mid-range deck. You can definitely take the long game against certain decks, like if you're against a more aggressive deck than red Jiren, like Gogeta Zeno or something like that. You can just try and play during your opponent's turn and use all of your evolves during your opponent's turn with the Spirit Boost to try and disrupt all of their plays. And then you can build a massive board during your opponent's turn whenever they swing and just try and kill them on the clapback. So getting into the Unison, obviously this deck is a Spirit Boost deck. Unlike with a lot of recent Spirit Boost decks like the yellow Helku deck or the black Shenron deck, this deck doesn't necessarily rely on the Spirit Boost skill as much as those decks would, but it just offers them that extra protection going into your opponent's turn, and so it's very useful to have. And so Spirit Boost decks, it's very important that they have a cheap Unison that's able to gain a lot of markers quickly, so that's why we're running 4 of the Topo Unison. It's a 1 specified red Unison. It has an auto once per turn. When one of your red battle cards evolves into this card, he gains 5k power for the turn and a marker. Because he's 5k base, the plus 5k power doesn't really come up all that often unless you're proactively trying to swing into an unawakened leader, which I did use quite a lot during the tournament. But on the defensive, that plus 5k is almost never relevant. But it's just a nice way to gain extra markers on the Unison that you use for Spirit Boosting. He has an Activate main where at the end of the turn you can play a red battle card with an energy cost of 1 from your hand in rest mode. So that's a +1 skill. So he's going to be gaining more markers off that, and because this deck is an evolve deck, you need to get your 1-drops out to start the chain going, and so your leader and your Unison both help you do that. And then he has a -7 where if your opponent has 3 or more life you deal 1 damage. That almost never comes up. It did end up coming up in the last round of the tournament, but as I said, I misplayed with it, so I lost anyway. But that's definitely a skill to watch out for, because often what will happen is your opponent will be at 3 life, and if you can get to the -7, you can -7 them down to 2 life and then swing with your big double strikers and try and finish them off. So that's the main utility of the -7, but mostly the Topo Unison is used for getting your 1-drops onto the board along with your leader, and also giving you consistent access to the Spirit Boost skill. And Topo Unison is the main card you want to be searching for. I think every single game that I didn't see the Topo Unison, I ended up full mulliganing my entire hand and just digging for that Topo Unison, because it's super important to try and get that card out on turn 1. Also, something that's important to note is because it's so imperative that you hit off your leader's frontside activate main, it's often beneficial for you to mulligan away your 1-drops during the start of the game, so that you have more of a chance of hitting your activate main leader skill. And speaking of the 1-drops, I'll get into the 1-drops we play now. So I was running 4 Jiren Thirst of Power, and I was also running 4 Jiren the Avenger. I think this is fairly standard for Jiren lists, because these are your evolve targets, because they're the actual 1-drop Jiren cards. The Jiren Thirst for Power has a permanent that gives 4-drop Jirens an EX evolve skill. That's only relevant for some of the older 4-drop Jirens that came out before this deck was released. And we're not playing any of those, so it's really irrelevant to this deck. But the main reason you play this card is because when it's played, you search the top 5 cards for a red Jiren or a red Unison with a specified cost of 1. So even if you don't see your Unison during your opening hand, if you hit this off of your leader's activate main, you can still search for your Unison and then play it on turn 1, which is really helpful. And there were a good few times where I just hit this card off the top 7 and was able to find the Unison because of it. And then the other 1-drop is Jiren the Avenger. When it's played, you draw a card, but he also has a really helpful activate main. It's limit 1, where if this card is in the drop area, you discard a card from your hand, place this card at the bottom of the deck, and then go search for a red Jiren that costs 5 or less and has an evolve skill. So if you're missing out on a piece from the evolve chain, you can go and search for it unless it's the 8-drop. But also it just comes up if you need cards, specific cards in the drop area, which we do run a few of and I'll get into in a bit later. But it's also just helpful if you're going for a really big push and you need a bit more combo power. You can start discarding your negates or something like that. So those are the 8 1-drop Jirens we're running, and then for other targets off of our leader effect, I'm running 2 of each of the Kunshis. So the first Kunshi, he basically gives all non-Kunshi Universe 11 cards that cost 1 in your battle area barrier. So he's going to give your 1-drop Jiren's barrier, and when it's played you draw a card. This definitely comes up sometimes, and I find that it's often useful just to have one of these to stick around. But the main reason that these 4 cards are in here is just to give you more targets off your leader frontside activate main. And then the other 2 Kunshi, they have the skill where when you play this card, you draw a card, and then you give an opponent's battle card minus 4k power for the turn. Now, this may seem very negligible and seem like it doesn't come up all that often, but it's actually really overperformed for me because it can snipe out cards like the 1-drop Basil, the 1-drop Lord Slug that goes up into the 3-drop. It can snipe out Berry Blue in the King Cold matchup, so it actually hits out a lot of really key cards, and that's why I ended up going for a 2-2 split, because there are definitely some situations where you want the barrier on your 1-drops because you have started to gain a massive board and you just want to be trying to protect it, but there's also at times where your opponent will have key cards that are 4k power and you can just get them off the board with the other Kunchi. Also, something that's important to note that I forgot to mention earlier is if you're given the option of both the Jiren 1-drops, so the Jiren 1-drops are the main ones you want to be taking off of your leader skill because they are revolve targets, and the Kunchis are only there as like a last resort if you don't see the Jiren 1-drops. But if you see both the Jiren 1-drops, and you would often think that you always want to be taking the Searcher because it gives you more options of what you can add to your hand. But if you feel like you already have enough of the Jiren chains in your hand, and you already have your Unison, you definitely want to go into Jiren the Avenger just to get the draw, and start digging for your non-Jiren pieces, because there are some really important non-Jiren pieces that can help you apply a lot of pressure in this deck. And it also means that you'll have that Jiren the Avenger in the drop area when it dies, so you can start getting the limit 1 to search for your other Jiren pieces. Then for the actual Jiren chain, I'm running 4 copies of the 4-drop, 4 copies of the 5-drop, and 4 copies of the 8-drop. I was testing the deck with 3 copies of the 8-drop before, and I was running 3 copies of the 8-drop in my original list, because I figured you can find it pretty easily, and you normally only need 1 or 2 in a game to try and end the game. But I found that 4 copies has definitely been much easier for me, because there were definitely times where I couldn't find the 8-drop Jiren and I really needed it. But he's your big finisher. He's a 35k double striker. He X evolves when you have 3 or more energy for 2 red. And the 8-drop and the 5-drop have a limit 1 skill on their EX evolve skill. When he's played, you minus 35k something through barrier, but then you can't play non-Universe 11 battle cards for the turn. So this is a really nice way to get through cards like, especially against yellow, you want to be getting through the 3-drop Lord Slug, you want to be getting through Absolute Annihilation Goku. So you can take out some really annoying barrier cards, and then against decks like Gogeta Zeno, you can take out the Marvelous Might Gogeta. And it's just really, really helpful that that goes through barrier, as well as effectively killing almost anything in the game that isn't a secret rare. And then he has an activate main where you send a card underneath him to the drop area. He restands himself and gives your leader plus 5k power for the turn. So that's how you get your leader above 25k base, is with copies of this 8-drop. He's just really incredible. The only time where he ever feels like a dead card in your hand is if you're against blue, because if you attempt to EX evolve and they God Sealing it back to your hand, then you're 2 energy behind and you can't EX evolve again because of the limit 1 keyword skill. So playing around God Sealing in this deck is really important, especially when it comes to the 8-drop. And oftentimes against blue decks, you'll be wanting to charge up to like 3 copies of your 8-drop, just because it's you're generally only ever going to get 1 copy out in a game against blue decks. For the 5-drop, this is probably the best EX evolver in the deck, or it's the best part of the chain. So he's a 19k dual attack, he EX evolves for 1 red energy, and he's also got the limit 1 on his EX evolve. Sorry, the 8-drop evolves over either the 4-drop or a 5-drop, and the 5-drop either evolves over a 4-drop or a 1-drop, then the 4-drop evolves only over the 1-drops. When he's played, you draw a card and then give one of your red Universe 11 leader cards or battle cards 1k power for the turn. This is generally only ever relevant during your opponent's turn because it acts similarly to a bean, where you can give your leader 1k power and it often gets you past that breakpoint of 15k power, which is most common for battle cards. They're going to be in multiples of 5 in general for their power, and so the 1k can end up disrupting some of their combos. But the other time that it's relevant is when you have 2 copies of him out on the board, well, if you have one copy out already and then you go to play a second one, you can give your first copy the plus 1k power, and that boosts it up to a 20k dual attacker, because otherwise you can't actually buff itself with the auto. It has to be a different card. And then he has an incredible permanent where if it would be removed by an opponent's skill, you can place 2 cards underneath it to the drop area instead, or you can take a life instead. So this is generally how you're going to be awakening earlier than turn 4, unless your opponent is attacking your leader at all. If they're just trying to remove this, then you can start taking life off of that, which is really helpful in terms of self-awakening. But it also has the alternative protection of dropping off 2 cards underneath it in case you are low on life and you still want to protect it. But that card is just really incredible. It's really impossible to remove, and oftentimes you want to be keeping it in active mode, so you only want to swing once with it, just so that your opponent can't attack over it during their next turn, because it can still be removed by battle, and it's only a 19k, so it can get swung over by only 20k in the game, or anything higher than that. So most of the time you're just keeping that in active mode going into your opponent's turn, unless you're pushing down to a really big breakpoint, like pushing them down to 5 life so that they are on a low life total, but they can't awaken next turn, or unless you're pushing for game or something like that. And then the 4-drop. The 4-drop is a free EX Evolve, and his limit 1 skill is on the auto skill rather than the EX Evolve skill, which actually comes up more than you would think, because it means you can drop multiple of these during a turn where you're trying to push for game. But you won't get the auto skill multiple times. But the auto is when this card is played, you draw 1 card, then choose up to one of your opponent's battle cards and give it minus 10k power for the turn. So this is just your main kind of early game play, where if your opponent is attacking into your leader or your unison or your battle cards, you can spirit boost this guy in minus 10k something, and generally if they're attacking into one of your battle cards, you spirit boost over that battle card or over that 1-drop to then make it a 15k body that they're attacking into. So oftentimes they have to combo in. But just the simple fact that this is a free evolve skill, it doesn't cost any energy, is really helpful for the deck, because it means that you're always going to have, as long as you have this card in a unison, you're always going to have your spirit boosts available to you. And something else that's really nice about the chain is that the 4-drop and the 5-drop both replace themselves. The 8-drop doesn't, but the 8-drop really doesn't need to, because it's kind of your finisher, so as soon as you drop it, you're going to either be taking a lot of cards out of your opponent's hand by them either negating or comboing out, or you're just going to be killing them most of the time. There is a 5-drop tournament pack Jiren that I was running at 1 copy, but I found just wasn't really helpful. I was only ever really running it for the fact that it was another name, and it was also a free EX Evolve that I could use in a pinch. But it searches the top 7 for a Universe 11 battle card, and then you have to bottom deck a card. So because you're not ever plussing off of it, and also because the card that you get rid of from your hand is going to the bottom of the deck rather than the drop area, it just felt like it was never really coming up, and most of games I was just charging it, so I ended up replacing that card for something else in the deck. But for the remaining Jiren cards, we're running 3 of the tournament pack Jiren from set 9. And he is gonna, so when he is, when you use his activate main, you can discard him from your hand, and then you can revive 2 Universe 11 battle cards from your drop area with their skills negated for the turn. So there's a couple of reasons why this card is insane for the deck. The first one being that it's the only card that plays your 1-drops in active mode other than hard casting them, and it also, like the rest of your skills, like your leader and your unison skill that play the 1-drops, it doesn't cost any energy. So this is really effective during your kill turns, because once you've swung out with all of your swings, you can then use this effect, revive 2 1-drops, and go up your evolve chains again, which is insane. The second reason why this card is so insane is because just for 1 card, it's effectively a 0-cost 10k combo power, because as long as you use it during your turn, you can revive 2 1-drops, and that's as long as you leave them active and you don't do anything with them. It will be a 1 card for 10k combo power, which is obviously really good, and similar to the blue Bojack deck, you want to be running a lot of copies of these, just like with the blue Bojack 8-drop that is 0-cost 10k in that deck. And then the final reason that this card is so good is that it's a it doesn't have any restrictions on it, so it's not like limit 1 or anything like that. You can use as many of these effects as you want during a turn, and So that means that if you have multiple copies, it's not even a bad thing in your hand. The only reason that I'm running 3 copies of this card and not 4 is I found that 4 was actually starting to get quite cloggy, just for the simple fact that this card is a yellow card, not a red card like the rest of your Jirens, because it was originally made for the yellow Jiren leader. And so it means that if you run 4 copies of this card and you have a good few black cards in the deck as well, it makes charging a lot more tricky in this deck. And so I ended up just keeping it at 3, but this card is a really strong card in the deck. And then for the non-Jiren cards, I am running 3 Yamcha Merciless Barrage. I think that 3 is honestly the perfect number. I don't think you need to run 4, because a lot of the time it's not really going to be live, because your Unison is a 1-cost 5k, and so going into your opponent's turn, it's going to only have 2 markers unless you've evolved, and generally you won't be evolving on the first turn, especially if you've gone first. And so all they have to do is swing into it once, and even if you use the Spirit Boost skill on your leader, it will still go down to 1 marker after the attack has been finished if your opponent is swinging into it with like a leader card or something like that. So 3 copies of this I found to be absolutely fine. I don't think you need 4. And also because its counterplay skill is only really, it's very underwhelming in certain matchups. Whereas with the Freezer counterplay and the Trunks counterplay for green and blue, they're obviously almost, like, they're really good cards in almost any matchup, basically. Something else that I forgot to mention with the Unison is the auto where you evolve a card and it gains a marker, because that's once per turn. You can trigger it once during your turn, once during your opponent's turn. So it means that if your opponent is swinging with a card and you Spirit Boost and then you evolve, your Unison will then gain back the marker that you lost from the Spirit Boost skill. So that's just something important to note. And then for the some of the other 1-drops in the deck, I am running 2 Broly Crown and 2 copies of Koitsukai. Originally, I did want to run a 3rd copy of Broly Crown, but I ended up realizing like half an hour before the tournament that I didn't own a 3rd copy of Broly Crown, so I was only able to play 2. But these cards really overperformed for me, and they have been overperforming for me ever since I started playing this version of the deck. So Broly Crown is obviously one of the best red staple cards, or one of the best red generic staple cards in the game. But it's also especially good in this deck because you can play it off of your Unison skill, because your Unison doesn't require a Universe 11. You can just play any red battle card that you want that costs 1. And so sometimes it can come up where you want to play this card at the end of your turn off of your Unison skill just to take another card out of your opponent's hand, especially if it's looking like your opponent is going to go for a more aggressive push during their next turn. And then Koitsukai is really good in this deck because you can discard it off of your Jiren the Avenger 1-drop when you want to use the effect from the drop area, and then that sets up the Koitsukai to use his effect from the drop area. So these 2 cards really overperform, and they're just your main way of dealing with floodgates outside of Baby Hatch, because most of the floodgate negates like Heroic Prospects, Topo Righteous Aid, all of those cards are generally powered at 20k or less, so you can either rip them out with Broly Crown because they'll leave 2 energy open to use the floodgate, or you can just Koitsukai and force them to drop 2 cards if they want to be using it. So those cards definitely overperformed with me throughout the day, and I want to give a shout out to Andre for not only lending me the Koitsukais and some of the other cards in the deck, but for recommending those cards. He's a big fan of running 4 Broly Crown and 3 Koitsukai, and just kind of shutting down any sort of control-y deck that wants to be playing floodgates. I opted not to go for that. I think 2 and 2 is all you really need, but I definitely would consider upping the Broly Crown to 3, as I mentioned before, and there was a card that I had to replace the 3rd Broly Crown with, which I'll show you later. But I think 3 copies of Broly Crown is probably worth running, just because of how much it's been overperforming for me. And then into some of the one-offs that you kind of have to run in this style of deck. We're obviously running 1 King Piccolo New Ruler. It's really easy to get your Unison to 3 markers. You can tap 1 for your Unison, +1 the Unison, and then evolve a card, and you'll be at 3 markers for 1 energy, and then that makes this card live. And this card is just amazing in any sort of red deck, even if it's not a hyper aggressive deck like this deck is. And then I'm also running 1 Hidden Power E Supreme Kai. I really wanted to up this card to 2, but I just couldn't find the space. But this card really overperformed for me throughout the day. And especially just the simple fact that you can stick it behind a leader swing and go up to 35k, 45k base power is really, really strong. And then to go with those, I'm also running 1 Fighting Against Fate and 1 Supreme Kai of Time. I think Fighting Against Fate is definitely the overarm of choice, and I also wanted to up that to 2 copies, but I again couldn't find the space. And then Supreme Kai of Time, it's, in my opinion, one of the better SCRs for the deck. I think the 3 that you would consider running are Supreme Kai of Time, Pan, Secret Rare from set 15, and Heroine's Lineage. I think Pan Secret Rare is definitely the best one for this deck. I just don't own it because the set's only just come out and the card is already priced at ridiculous numbers, so I'm likely not to own it for the foreseeable future. And then I borrowed this as well, but I think the argument between Kai and Lineage is that Lineage you can't really use it offensively, unless you know that you're going to survive until your opponent's next turn, or until your next turn, sorry, and then you just steal a battle card during your opponent's turn and then use it as an extra swing. But I think that Supreme Kai of Time just has more flexibility within the deck, because you can use it as a 40k swing, but you can also use it to clear a board, and then you can also use it to stop Unison and leader attacks during your opponent's turn. So it just has more flexibility, in my opinion, than Heroine's Lineage does. Something that's really important to note is that you can't play these cards after. These are the main cards, like the main proactive cards, other than the Jiren chain in the deck. And it's really important to note that you can't play these cards after you evolve the 8-drop, so you need to be dropping all of these if you're pushing for game before you drop the 8-drop down. So that's something important to note. And something else that's important to note is if you're evolving the 8-drop during your opponent's turn, it locks you out of things like Yamcha counterplay or Supreme Kai of Time for the turn, because you're still not able to play non-Universe 11 battle cards for the turn. For super combos, I ended up running 2 Cocotte and 2 Raditz. There were a couple of reasons to this choice in split, because I think Raditz is obviously the best standalone super combo, but Cocotte has utility within this deck, because you can, if your opponent swings to your Unison on turn 1, you can use your leader effect to Spirit Boost and then evolve a 4-drop generally, and then you can use the auto on Cocotte to stick it under the Unison, go back up to 3 markers and draw a card. So it definitely has some really strong utility in this deck, because it means even after 1 attack on your Unison, your Yamcha counterplays are going to be live during your opponent's turn on turn 1, which is obviously really strong. But then Raditz is just the best standalone super combo. And so I think that 2-2 split on this is really okay. I'm not sure if I'd go one way or another quite yet, but also I only own 2 Raditz super combos, so I was definitely going to be playing at least 2 Cocotte super combo. And then for the last 4 cards in the deck, I'm running 4 Testing the Opposition. This was the extra card that I had to replace the 3rd copy of Broly Crown with. I was originally running 3 copies, and I think that 3 copies is all you need. I do not think 4 copies is really warranted in this deck, because it's mainly primed to be an aggressive deck, or sometimes it can play as a mid-range deck. But you definitely don't need more than 3 of these, in my opinion. And most of the time I found that I was double drawing these and just drawing these in multiple copies when I was trying to make an aggressive push. And then obviously that meant that I had a lot less combo power in my hand when I was going for game, which definitely hurt me in the long run. So I definitely recommend replacing one of these for a 3rd Broly Crown, or if you want to go a different route and replace one of these for a 2nd Double Strike Kai or Champa, or a 2nd Overrealm, then those are also very good options. But that is the entire deck profile, and as I mentioned before, I managed to come 2nd place in the TCG Metalz tournament. And definitely shout out to TCG Metalz, and shout out to the Hill Twins for streaming the event. It was it was an American event, but I ended up entering anyway just because it seemed like a fun event to enter, and I ended up doing very well with it, so I'm definitely really happy with how I performed. If you guys are interested in any of my matchups or how I piloted the deck throughout, I'm not going to go through it during this video, but if you want to comment down below and ask some questions about that, then definitely feel free, and I'll try and get back to you when I can. And if you guys have also any criticisms of the video, or of the deck profile, definitely comment those below. I'd love to take in any sort of criticisms that you guys might have. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and definitely subscribe to stay updated with all of the channel's content. And I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one.